So again, good morning. I'm Linda Scott, Dean of the University of Wisconsin-Madison School of Nursing, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our presentation in honor of National Nurses Week, which starts on May 6th. So I'm so excited to see so many of you here today. Our theme for Nurses Week is 4 million reasons to celebrate, recognizing the contributions and impact of the 4 million registered nurses in the United States. Nurses Week ends on May 12th, which also happens to be Florence Nightingale's birthday. Most of you will know Flo, but know her more than just carrying the lamp. She was a strong believer in the relationship between environment and health, as well as the responsibility of nurses in environmental sustainability. Therefore, it is fitting to have Dr. Elizabeth Schenk with us today as our keynote speaker. Dr. Schenk has dual roles. First, she is a nurse scientist based at St. Patrick Hospital in Missoula, Montana, where she leads nursing research efforts across the 50-plus hospital Providence St. Joseph Health System. As a nurse scientist, her primary research interest is in the environmental impacts of healthcare and nursing practice. She is also an assistant research professor at the Washington State University College of Nursing. Dr. Schenk has developed the Nurses Environmental Awareness Tool, which has been used in multiple states and several foreign countries to assess nurses' awareness of the environmental impacts of hospital-based care. She has also co-developed the Climate Health and Nursing Tool, otherwise known as CHANT, to monitor the nursing profession's perceptions and behaviors related to climate change and health. In her board role for the Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments, Dr. Schenk produces and hosts the Nurses for Healthy Environments podcast. So I think that's going to be something that we all will want to tune into. But as you can see from her background, we are so fortunate to have Dr. Schenk here today at the School of Nursing. Her keynote presentation, Environmental Stewardship in Nursing, a Call to Action, transcends both professional and educational affiliations within nursing and beyond. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Elizabeth Schenk to the podium.
Thank you so much. So glad to be here. Well, thank you all for coming, and I'm thrilled to be here in Wisconsin, partly because I'm a fan of women's hockey. Congratulations, and go Badgers. So just to let me know who is in the room. Second, I have a technical question. I don't need to worry about it. Okay, we'll see. So who's in the room? How many nurses do we have? And how many of you are students? Right, welcome. How many other health professionals do we have? All right, how many people from the community do we have? How many people from other places in the university do we have? Right? And how many hockey players do we have? None? There's got to be some. Oh. Okay, anyway. Thank you very much for coming, and I'm really excited to talk to you today. And this is what we're going to talk about. I'm going to talk just a little bit about planetary level environmental health concerns, and then a little bit more about Thank you. Except it went away. It went away. Okay. I'm going to leave this off. Okay. All right. Sorry about that. Then I'm going to go over a little bit. What does this have to do with nursing, particularly? My focus is nursing. I know not everyone here is a nurse, but I appreciate you all coming along on this nursing conversation today. It impacts nursing because the environment impacts health, and also healthcare impacts the environment, and that's where I focus. Also, I'm going to introduce for the first time a framework to address this in nursing practice. So I've been developing a framework that's going to be published later this year, and you truly are the first guinea pig audience to hear about it. So thank you for wading through that with me, and then I'll share a few resources. So what is the problem that we're talking about? It's both a global problem and a local problem. It's both a systemic problem around the world in all dimensions, and it's a nursing practice problem and others. We can see here, this is just a montage of photographs that is not new news to any of you, but you can see on the left, there are some drivers of our overall environmental crisis. We are in the midst of an environmental crisis. It's escalating as we speak. And those of us who are alive right now are facing this and will face it really for our lives. We have pollution from power plants at the top. We have deforestation as an example of land use choices that are sometimes a little bit excessive. We have novel entities in the bottom. Those are plastics, and there are lots of other chemicals that are entering our world. In the middle section, we see some of the harm that comes from this in terms of changes to the environment itself, from air-polluted cities to flooding that I know some of you are experiencing near here, to forest fires, which I live with in the summers. And on the right, we see some of these health impacts that we're starting to appreciate from climate change, but also from exposures to chemicals and others. There's a concept called ecosystem services that probably some of you have heard about. And it is the function of the planet really to produce a number of the elements that really make life possible. For instance, oxygen, for instance, a stable climate, for instance, nutrients in soil, for instance, genetic diversity. So these are really functions that emerge from the complex and miraculous way that the planet works. It's necessary for life, and it's necessary for our health. However, we're chipping away at it a little bit in what we now call the Anthropocene, or the Anthropocene, if you pronounce it that way. And that is considered an era of geological time in which really humans are impacting the planet more than other features are. So this is important work out of Stockholm, and I'm sure some of you have seen this as well. The scientists there started to get interested in, well, if we have these ecosystem services that really we are dependent on, are we living within our planetary means, and how would we know that? What are the boundaries of our planetary pollution that beyond which we should not go? So they identified these 9 areas, 9 buckets, and they start to measure what's happening in each of these. So the first publication of this was in 2009. They updated it and published again in 2015. We're expecting another publication before too long because they track this over time. So as an example, you can see that 2 areas are in the red, and that means really we're getting beyond our boundaries. We are in danger. Those 2 are genetic diversity and biogeochemical flows, which is really phosphorus and nitrogen, and that's really related to our agricultural practices and uses of chemicals. There are 3 areas that we have question marks in because we don't have data yet to track. They didn't in 2015. Another aspect of diversity, novel entities, which is chemicals, and atmospheric aerosol loading. Now, we don't need to understand the details of those levels. This is a conceptualization to let us know that we are actually starting to track in measurable ways. Are we living within our planetary means? I think this is a very helpful concept that informed the framework I'm going to share with you. Because also I've pulled out 3 of these entities that I think are really related to healthcare and to nursing practice. Climate change, and I know that you're all aware of that and some of the details, and I won't go into a ton of details, but a little bit. Biodiversity loss, which is happening at breakneck speed, and it's not just the big, beautiful creatures we're concerned about, it's the small creatures as well that help us with soil formation, help us keep pollination going, etc. And so we're making some impacts that are putting us at risk, as you knew from that graph before. Resource depletion really includes several of those buckets, and one of the ways we see that in healthcare is through the vast use of disposable products. When we blow through so many resources, it actually is finite. We really don't live on a finite planet. We treat it like it is, but we really don't. These all lead to health risks, and also healthcare leads to these problems. It contributes to these problems. We're not the only contributor. But what are these contributions that come from healthcare? This is a cycle that we really don't want to be a part of. So you can see at the top, someone may have a disease or illness, and they'll come to healthcare to access services. In the process of that, healthcare creates healthcare pollution. And then in the process of that, it adds further to the risk of disease and illness. So this is a vicious circle we really don't want to be a part of. We know down here that we already currently focus a lot on healthcare-acquired conditions or harm that's caused unintentionally through healthcare. We work hard on infection prevention, on preventing falls, on reducing pressure ulcers, on wrong-size surgery, on medication administration errors, etc. We really pay attention to that and are heavily invested. However, we are creating this other kind of harm, and we don't pay attention to that. We don't track it. A few places do. About a quarter of the hospitals in the U.S. we know do. We are not held accountable for it. We don't have to pay more or get less reimbursement. It really is not part of our equation for the most part. And yet we know that it's causing problems. So I want to just tell you about this important study and refer you to it. It came out in 2016 by Eckelman and Sherman from Yale. And they took 10 years of healthcare-generated pollution. They took as many aspects as they could find, and they correlated it to known health risk. And what they found, they interpreted that in terms of DALYs, which is disability-adjusted life years that some of you know from your epidemiology and public health courses. And they found that it created risk at the same order of magnitude as all these other healthcare-acquired conditions that we work so hard to fight. So it's like we have two buckets of healthcare-acquired conditions. One we address, and we've managed to etch down, and the other one we don't address, don't pay attention to, and actually it's going up. And if they're the same order of magnitude, that's a tremendous amount of harm. So this is the area that bothers me a lot, and that I really spent many years working on, and that's what we'll be talking about today. Just a tiny overview, and I'm going to go into more detail of healthcare's environmental footprint, and I imagine this is not news to you. We're very energy intensive. Healthcare creates 10% of greenhouse gases. I just learned literally on the way here on a podcast that higher ed, so universities in America, create 2%. I thought that would have been higher, but that tells me again, wow, healthcare really is energy intensive. Second highest user of energy in the service sector, and that's second to food. So that's interesting when you think about how much food is in our lives every day. 2 to 3 times as energy intensive of office buildings. Waste stream is very complex. Much of it is regulated. I'm going to talk more about that. But this concept, 29 pounds per patient per day. So you think about that. Every patient that comes through the door, this is on an adjusted patient day basis, 29 pounds. Now this is probably conservative because this is based on hospitals that measure and report this. It's probably closer to 40, I'm going to guess. The average household is 4. And that's, even that's a lot, actually. And then lastly, the chemicals of concern. So it's thought that nurses are the second most exposed occupation for chemicals at the workplace, first being janitorial staff. And that's because we're right there in the trenches. We are there with the cleaning chemicals, there with the high-risk pharmaceuticals, there with the packaging that we open and get exposed to different chemicals. So that's a broad picture, and I'm going to have more detail. So this little explosion here is these health impacts. So what are they? This is a very quick review of really environmental health impacts generally, but healthcare contributes to all of these. So from energy, fossil fuel particularly burning energy, even without climate change, it causes problems. From the air pollution that it contributes, mercury toxicity, that's potent neurotoxin, as you know, respiratory illness, heart disease, and cancers, and then the plethora of climate change health impacts that I hope that you've been exposed to already. Hydraulic fracturing is how we get natural gas. Natural gas is one way we get natural gas. Natural gas is lower in greenhouse gas emissions, it's true, but it's not perfectly safe in its harvest either, and that's really through air and water pollution related to several important environmental health outcomes. Waste in our country is usually handled pretty well. We're not usually at risk from our waste, but it all depends on how well it's segregated. And that really is a nursing issue in the healthcare system. But in the general population, it depends on, well, did you really just end up pouring your gasoline or something near a stream? So it really depends on what we as humans do with this, because there could be chemical exposures and hormone disruption as part of that, because so many of our chemicals are hormone disruptors. Infectious disease, depending on our infectious waste. And again, this overuse of materials and goods, hard to avoid, I realize, but that is contributing to the resource depletion I mentioned. And then waste also creates climate impacts, largely because of the breakdown in landfills that then creates methane, but also by the overuse and production of goods. Toxic chemicals is probably the best known aspect of environmental health because that's what we've studied the longest. And so we know that toxicants are called toxicants because they're toxic, and that means they're toxic to life and cells. And so we are aware of that, we study that, we need to continue to study that. There are also some mental and emotional health aspects of our environmental crisis and of specific environmental events. So for the broad scale, for all of us, people like me and maybe some of you, the concepts that we're talking about can be overwhelming. That can lead to stress and anxiety, depression, an overwhelmed feeling about the future. This is important for us to reckon with. It's important for us to find a way to come to peace with that through grieving, perhaps, through learning, through talking more about it, because unfortunately it's here to stay, and we do need to be able to activate ourselves to help. That's my opinion. Also with events that happen, such as fires or the flooding that you're experiencing here in the Midwest, that's very disrupting to lifestyles, livelihoods, home, et cetera. That creates a lot of depression and anxiety, especially in people who depend on the land for their work. Outdoor workers, farmers, ranchers, is where most of the studies have been done in this regard. We know that heat particularly is linked to increase in violence. That's been known for some time about domestic violence, but it's also been tracked now with criminal violence as well. And then the community impacts after disasters and in preparedness can be overwhelming. And I hope that, I always feel a little bit like when I talk like this at breakneck speed, I am overwhelming to the people I'm talking to. So, so it's kind of true. This is a hard topic. It's a hard topic, but we need to face it and talk through it and learn more about it all. I was talking with folks who had been in the Santa Barbara fires 2 years ago, and they really talked about this experience of community PTSD. It is so disruptive to what they knew and lived with before. The response systems may be adequate, they may not be adequate. We see that currently, especially in Puerto Rico, the struggles that people are going through to try and recover. Really hard, takes a lifetime to recover, and sometimes it still is the case. Just a note about migration. This is happening now and will continue to happen more as places where people are dependent on conditions to grow food and have water change. So this is something we also need to get used to and start to develop humane planning for. So thinking back to healthcare now, one issue I run up against, someone was asking me this morning about barriers, and one issue I run up against a lot for practicing nurses as well as nursing leaders is there's so much on our plate. There's so much that we are learning to do, that we need to do to care for the individuals and families right in our care. That we may be aware outside of work of all this stuff I just described to you. You read about it in the news, you think about it yourselves, you see it in your lives, then we get back in front of our patient. It's like, well, that doesn't compute. I've got to do this work. Same with our executives. I was just with our system executives this past week. You can't believe what's on their plates, trying to make this whole thing of healthcare work within budgets, within workforce issues, within quality, within regulatory. It's unbelievably challenging. And so same thing, recognize that this is a problem, but the fires in front of all of us are too intense. I think, however, for us to really start to bring that together, we have to create threads that let us understand these links a little better and find pathways through it. So I just have a few examples here of ways that this impacts at the patient and family level. These won't be new to you, but if cleaning chemicals affect janitorial staff and affect us, you know they affect our patients, especially patients with respiratory threat. Some of you, I think, know about phthalates in plastics, especially that some of this work came out in the 90s with NICU babies. Is this a familiar story about softening it? DEHP, diethyl hexylphthalate, is a softening agent used in IV tubing. Otherwise, it would be, they say, like PVC pipes. And so it has to be softer and pliable. But those phthalates are hormone-disrupting chemicals. So back in the 90s, it was observed, particularly in NICUs, because the babies are so small, a kilogram perhaps, that they were dosed heavily with chemicals from the plastic. Ventilators, IVs, feeding tubes, Foleys, really everything that went into their body was through plastic. And so they noticed that the genitalia were not forming appropriately or on time, basically, and this was mostly in the males. And so that led to this recognition and led to nursing. Nurses were often the leaders of getting DEHP out of ICUs, out of neonatal ICUs. I want to point out that it's still available and on the market, though, so you can all check at your practice site to see if you're using DEHP-free IV tubings and bottles. Since then, in 2004, the FDA came out with a statement that said, adults who have chronic disease are getting multiple IV transfusions or multiple blood transfusions also should not be exposed to this chemical. So I say, well, isn't that everyone in hospitals? Everyone has chronic diseases, right? So we just need to get it out of our system, but it's still available. So that's another example. And there are others. How does this impact at the local or community level? Well, hazardous waste, if it's not segregated, can certainly get into air and water. Pharmaceuticals in water and soil. Now, this is a bigger problem than just healthcare because it also goes through all of our bodies as consumers of pharmaceuticals. I was really surprised when I learned, I live in Montana, and the lakes up high have pharmaceuticals. So now, how is that? It's not born in the air. The pharmaceuticals don't volatilize and get transported like other chemicals. So the thought is it's really animal and human movement in the water cycle as we walk around and urinate and drink and that sort of thing. If we move out to the region, so when we use power in our health system or hospital or university, and that power is purchased from a power plant that burns fossil fuels, then we are actually contributing to the harm that those fossil fuels cause. So this is why there's a big push in healthcare amongst those hospitals that are working on it, those health systems that are working on it, to reduce fossil fuel sourcing. Another example is from our agriculture system, which does cause problems. We know that that's already one in the red zone on the planetary boundaries. And so we need to be addressing those fundamental problems as well. And to the extent that we don't, we're contributing to that outcome also. Oftentimes, hospitals are the largest water user in a community, so it's important, especially in drier areas, that we're aware of that and not depleting the sources for either quantity or quality. And then the planetary regions interactions are really these three and beyond. It's really the whole picture, but to just have a few that we can grab a hold of are these that I've called out. So for climate change, clearly we're contributing to climate change in healthcare. We are in our daily lives too, and this is not to scold any of us. It's just to point out that this is the reality we live in. And I think, at least for healthcare, it can embolden us to help address it. Same with resource depletion. We were talking this morning about the difficulty of our materiality these days. Hard to not use a lot of resources because we have moved to a disposable culture, we've moved to a chemical-based culture, and that's just where we are. I'm optimistic that we can move through that, but it's going to take transformation. And biodiversity loss, which is also part and parcel of how all these interact with each other. Okay, so that really is what I'm going to say about planetary health. And now what I work on is this point. How can we reduce this healthcare pollution? So that's really my focus, and that's what I'm going to talk to you now about in more detail with some solutions. All right, so as mentioned, I'm presenting this framework for the first time. Why a framework? Well, this stuff is kind of complicated. And we don't really know where to start. Not only nurses, but lots of people don't know where to start. Frameworks help to define and describe relationships and to provide action. And in nursing, we're used to frameworks. They make sense to us, and we refer to them. Why nurses? Well, we're the largest health profession in the nation and in the world. 4 million here, 30 million around the world. We get this. This is in our heritage, and it's part of what makes sense to us because health is always contextual, not just cellular. Also, we are present in most healthcare settings and circumstances in this country. So we see it. We are really the practice experts for this sort of work. We have a professional obligation, and I'm going to talk more about that. We're the most trusted voice again and again. I hope you all know that since Gallup has been testing every year but one, it has been nurses as the most trusted voice. And that 1 year was, does anybody know? The firefighters, that's right, in 2001. The timing is important right now because the environmental crisis is worsening, and also there's a greater awareness of this. It's really satisfying for myself, who've been working on this for about 30 years, to see the enthusiasm and mobilization right now amongst all people, including our young people who have a lot of energy. I'm grateful. What is environmental stewardship in healthcare? This is my own amalgamation of several definitions, but I would say it's the use of responsible practices, processes, and products that decrease pollution and harm to the natural environment, communities, individuals, other species, and future generations. It's similar to definitions of sustainability, but it's a little bit different the way I see that, and that would be a different lecture, so I won't go there right now. So looking through the literature and looking through my work across this area over time, there are a few content schemes. So this is how do other people organize the actual work? What is the actual content-based work we need to do? Practice Green Health is a wonderful organization that is an offspring of Healthcare Without Harm. Both of those are great resources for anyone interested in this work. And they break it into these buckets: leadership, energy, water, waste, chemicals, food, climate. EPP means environmentally preferable purchasing, though it also means sustainable procurement. Green building, greening the OR. So there are goals in each of those categories and ways that people can help lead that work. The Healthier Hospitals Initiative is similar, and it's related. A little bit easier, more straightforward: leadership, food, energy, waste, chemicals, and purchasing. So you can start to see a theme. The bottom is the UDI wheel. This is something I developed in 2011. And I was interested in getting to the fundamentals of each of those, and I believe that the fundamentals, the source causes, were really energy, waste, and toxicants. However, I wanted it on this bed of engagement. So that circle at the bottom is engagement, which is how do we talk about it? How do we learn? How do we measure? How do we teach each other? How do we keep people engaged? How do we maintain our own stamina and interest? How do we advocate and promote health? So I'm now going to introduce my content scheme for this framework, which is similar. And the first is waste. So we've talked about waste quite a bit. This is the list of waste types. There may be a couple more depending on how you see it in healthcare. And you know these: biohazard, that's infectious waste. Chemo and pathologic waste are treated differently than biohazard. They need to be collected differently. Pharmaceutical hazardous, that means EPA determined RCRA hazardous, is different than pharmaceutical non-hazardous. Those need to be separated and collected differently and treated differently, both expensive. Narcotics, that's ruled by a whole different division of the government, and that needs to be collected separately, treated differently. Waste anesthesia gas is not regulated at all, but it's a significant pollutant. And then recycling, compost, and landfills. These are common areas that people collect waste differently and report it. Opportunities are to segregate properly. That's really a very important thing. And I think it's not just in nursing, it's really in our society that people actually believe that waste goes somewhere. When you throw it away, our whole concept of it is we throw it away. What we should say is, no, we're going to move this to this hole in the ground and bury it forever, because that's where it goes. It does not go away. And also, after you put something in a waste bin, nobody goes and puts it in the correct waste bin. It's up to us to segregate, and this is at all levels, even in your local recycling or your recycling here in the school. Source reduction is really opportunities to reduce our disposable items and use more reusables. It's not always an easy thing to do, but it's possible, and there are good examples around the country. Reprocessing is, some companies are licensed to take single-use items, clean them, inspect them, repair them, re-sterilize them, and sell them back or sell them to another facility for about half the price. So this is a real win-win situation that we can use products longer and also save significant dollars. We save tens of millions of dollars in our health system by really pursuing the SUD reprocessing. And then using less as possible. We've talked about the climate impacts of waste, so I don't think I need to go over that. But what I've done on each of these slides is circle those items that I think nursing can impact particularly. For this one, I think all of these are really within our reach. We are the handlers of materials very often, we are the segregators, and we can be the experts on this. And also waste, partly because it's the most visible thing, is the one that people talk to me about first. Bothers nurses a lot to be throwing away so much and going through the products so much. So we can become experts there. Next category is energy and water. We've talked about the fossil fuel harms from burning fossil fuel. I also want to just mention about water use. It's also important to conserve water because, first of all, we don't want to threaten aquifers and surface water. And secondly, it costs energy to treat and move water. So whenever we're using water, we're also contributing to climate change. There are opportunities. One is renewable energy sources. Now, this may seem a little bit out of reach for nurses, but as I was saying this morning, this is something we can ask of our practice sites. Do we have a plan for getting off fossil fuels? What is the timeline? Can we get there by 2030, 2035? So that's a legitimate question for us because, as I mentioned this morning, as nurses, we are clinicians and professionals who are practicing at a practice site. I know that usually we think of we're employed by the hospital or by the university, and therefore we can only do what they say. But really, I would push back on that and say, no, we're choosing where we practice. And we can do that with some knowledge about some of these areas as well. We have a little more pull on energy conservation and water conservation, and so we can talk about that a little bit more. In fact, I guess that's what I think is really more within our reach. So that could be in establishing room occupancy. When the room is empty, what are the best settings for energy conservation? Are the lights off, the TV, the bathroom? Is the temperature set at the optimal amount? Unless you're in a fabulous building like this where it's probably optimized automatically. Many hospitals are not. They will be in the future though. Same with water conservation. Are there things to build into practice that will help us do that? Next category is ag and food. So again, agriculture and food is a big deal because we eat regularly and we eat a fair amount. But look how much we waste. 30 to 40% of our food in the US. That's astonishing to me. That was $161 billion last year. So this is an issue that we can probably help with. I know that we're not the dietitians and not nutrition services as nurses, but oftentimes it's nurses who really push on this work because it tends to bother nurses. Meats are considered to be more impactful in terms of greenhouse gases, so we can at least limit our meat consumption perhaps and help to make sure that there are non-meat options. Opportunities include bringing local and sustainable foods more in. That helps support our local communities and helps us know that a community can actually grow some food in case something happens that would require that. Used to be that all communities grew food. I know some statistics from Montana. Up until about World War II, we grew 70% of our food, and now it's about 5%. Most of it is shipped elsewhere for final processing, like cattle. Nurses can help push for CSAs, community-supported agriculture shares, gardens on site, therapeutic gardens, food-growing gardens, gardens for sensory development for people who've been brain injured, a lot of opportunity related to food and getting people back to soil. Reusable dishware, this is something we talked about this morning as well. It's because even compostable dishware is really resource intensive. It's probably a little bit better than recyclable because we can't always recycle, but the very best is reusable, even though you have to wash it. And so there are case studies about that, and so that's a good thing to keep pushing for. Bringing in other healthy items. And so what I've said nurses can do is help avoid single-use plastics in our workplaces and in our personal lives, and also help to really bring in some of these alternatives. Okay, the next of the categories is chemicals. Chemicals is complicated, and it's complicated in our world because it's not well regulated, honestly, still. We have a new law through 3 or 4 years ago that finally updated the TSCA, the Toxic Chemicals Act from the 1970s. But it is still not strong enough, in my opinion, and it's not strong enough compared to European laws, for example. So this is something that we as consumers need to be aware of and that we as nurses need to be aware of in our practice sites. This list is some common chemicals of concern in healthcare. This is a harder area to address, in my opinion, and I've worked at it for a while. And so I think sometimes the best things that we can do is really know what we're exposed to and how do we protect ourselves. And it's not very transparent. Just need to warn you about that now. But this is the sort of thing that a practice council or an interested group could really take on and develop some expertise at a particular place, including at a university, to see, well, what are we talking about in terms of the finishes, the building materials, the air quality, the actual chemicals we open and use. Another question that I often say is, just like that question about what is the practice site doing for renewable energy, we can also say, now listen, if we're using these chemicals, do we need to? Is there another option? Is there a less harmful option? This is a legitimate question, and it helps reduce risks for everyone, probably oftentimes ends up saving money as well. So it's a good thing to take forward. Just want to point out a little bit about climate impacts of chemicals. So I mentioned the waste anesthesia gas situation, and I'm sure you've heard about this, but there are 3 common inhaled agents, and then there's also nitrous oxide. Of the 3 common inhaled agents, one particularly is very disruptive to the atmosphere, and it's a potent greenhouse gas, 3,600 times as potent. Astonishing. And we just vent it straight into the atmosphere. We scavenge it out of the OR rooms because we don't want people getting sick or anesthetized on the job, but we put it straight into the atmosphere because we don't have other great options. And same with nitrous oxide, which may be used in birthing centers, it may be used in the OR, it may be used in dentistry centers, may be used in ED even. This is a place also that can leak. I know this because I've been tracking our nitrous oxide for a while, and last year it shot up. I couldn't figure out why. I was talking to all the clinicians, and no, they didn't have changes in the birthing center. They didn't have changes in the ORs. The anesthesiologist said they really just don't use it. So we finally found it, and it was leaking in one of the columns in one of the OR rooms. So we expect that will turn that problem completely, will make that problem go away, but I would still like to reduce use overall. So that sort of thing is important. And also, many of our chemicals are actually petrochemicals. So the chemicals that we use in everyday life have actually come from fossil fuels, many of them. And so that too contributes. This is the last category of the content area, and it's transportation. So I didn't used to include transportation, partly because it's difficult and partly because many organizations don't consider employee transportation as part of their problem or part of their footprint. But I don't see why we'd all be going to the hospital or the university if it wasn't our job. So I do think it's related. And also, unfortunately, transportation just in the past year, maybe 2017, has passed buildings as the highest source of greenhouse gases. Partly because our buildings are getting more efficient, and also our cars have now gotten less efficient again. So what can we do? It's easier in places that are parking constrained, where it's really difficult to park. That gets people to take public transport more, ride their bike, walk. You have Dr. Patz here, who has worked hard on the co-benefits of active transportation. That's absolutely right. So what I think nurses can do is really work on those elements. It's harder to work on changing the entire system. We're waiting for a system change, which will come. It really will come. I heard a fascinating speaker not long ago, last year, maybe, at Clean Med. Was that last year? And he was predicting this flashpoint, which will transform the transportation energy just like the cell phone transformed our communications within about a 5-year period. And he said it depends on batteries, driverless cars, and ride-hailing, I think were the 3 things. And so he said that when enough of those sweet spots come together, we are rather suddenly not going to need nearly as many cars. He said that at a given time, only 20% of the world's cars are on the road. Isn't that astonishing? 80% of the world's cars are parked. And that will really change things. On this podcast that Dr. Scott mentioned, I interviewed an architect, or a nurse who works for an architectural firm, and I was really curious, in San Francisco, I was really curious about how are they handling long-term building planning given for parking. Because right now, parking dominates our world, doesn't it? Probably dominates the campus here, I'm not sure. But buildings are planned around that. And so he said what they're doing is they are still building parking, but they're telling people, have your next use for this space in mind, and let's build it with that in mind. If we need to beef up the structure now, if we need to put in drainage now, let's do that, because it's not going to be long in which that changes. But for now, it's our biggest contribution to climate change, and so we need to. Thoughts? Okay, so that means the key domains here in my new scheme are these: waste, energy, ag and food, chemicals, and transportation. And you can see that that spells an easy to remember mnemonic that is we act. So there can be levels of action in this we act scheme. So imagine this as a bullseye, and we are wanting to get to that middle circle. So on the outside, there may be places that aren't doing too much. You know, they may not be doing anything. Oops. Sorry. Moving in, doing a little bit more. Okay, some modest work. Maybe doing a little recycling, maybe have some LED bulbs, doing a bit. And then the next level, really doing quite a bit. It's substantial. Hitting on all the main indicators, reporting data, could be doing more. And then those rare organizations, hospitals, clinics, universities, et cetera, that are really hitting the ball out of the park on all the main indicators. And they are getting close to environmentally safe and healthy nursing practice. That phrase will come back. So if we pull this together, we are driving towards environmentally safe and healthy nursing practice by reducing waste and energy and by reducing the harm from ag, chemicals, and transportation. That brings us in toward this central goal. All right, now that's part of the framework, and there's key professional elements as well. So first is our professional obligation. And I hope these are familiar documents to the nurses in the room. We have our social policy statement, our code of ethics, and our standards of practice. These are fabulous documents, and if every profession had them, our world would be problem-free, or a lot closer. So I've just pulled some key things out of each one, because in the social policy statement, we promote the health of the public. We know this. It's not just the person in front of us and in our daily care, but our actions need to promote the health of the public as well. We do this with caring, service, and compassion, which we are very committed to and very good at. And we also, I want to call out, do this in hazardous service. That's important now because we are experiencing more hazard in our care related to climate change. I think back to the AIDS crisis in the 80s. I became a nurse in the mid-80s. And there were nurses then who said, I didn't sign up for this. This is too hazardous. We lost nurses from the profession. But even then I thought, well, wait a minute, who's going to take care of these people? That's really what our profession does. Similarly, our profession takes care of people even though they're in the midst of a forest fire or they're in the midst of significant flooding. So you've seen those images of the elders in wheelchairs sitting in water in their flooded nursing home. You've seen the pictures of the nurses with flashlights in their teeth carrying babies out on the stairs because the power's out for the elevators. You've seen the images of nurses in California putting patients in their own cars to drive them out of the fire. Now, it is horrifying to say that that is our reality today, but I'm afraid that's our reality today. There will be more of those events, so it's realistic for us as nurses to have some plans in mind for our specific regional issues. In my world, it's fire and flooding. Here, it's flooding and perhaps tick-borne disease. You know, look into that a little more. Okay, next is code of ethics. It's really more about that same idea that we promote, advocate for, and protect the rights, health, and safety of all of these people we care for. And the last one's really the most clear to me, and it's in our scope and standard, and it's Standard 17, which states the registered nurse practices in an environmentally safe and healthy manner. There's a lot of competencies involved with that related to education and practice, but to me this says we don't pollute. So I think we are professionally obligated to address this issue. Now, of course, it's my opinion, but it's a learned opinion, and I hope that makes sense to you all as clinicians. The next of my key elements that support this work is leadership. So, of course, formal leaders, our executives and directors and managers can do so much to propel this work through decision-making, strategic planning, making room and shared governance for this to bloom, moving the boulders, so getting those really intractable pieces out of the way so that this work can progress and offer reward and recognition for the work. Also, much of this work is driven out of grassroots passion, so it's individuals who bring this craving to their work, this frustration that we don't have to create so many problems in our practice. And I'd say historically this has been the main way that nursing has engaged with this. And they become the thought leaders and the champions and the role models. And this is really important. And I want to remind us that advocacy is always a piece of our leadership. That's both internal in our work sites and also external in our communities. Thrilling to see more nurses running for office. I hope all of you or some of you will consider that. And at least that we communicate regularly with our elected officials. The voice of a nurse, because we are the most trusted, has power. So always put RN or whatever your credentials are when you do write your folks. The next element is education. We're in the right place to talk about that. And we know that in formal education, you all here are doing a fabulous job of including this content, including having me, and I appreciate that so much. But also I know it's in many of your course contents, and you all as students are being exposed to this. I also know that's not the norm across the country. My colleague in Washington State recently surveyed Northwest faculty, so it was a section of the country, to ask about climate change content and also environmental stewardship content, and it was about 18% on average. So that is low, because the way I see this is a problem we need to know about and to be prepared for. So they're failing their students in that regard, in my opinion, and so that's something that we can all help push for. There's also many opportunities to learn at the practice-based level through journal clubs, lectures, et cetera, and there's a lot of lifelong learning opportunity. But this is something we have to sometimes seek out. It's not just spoon-fed to us. The next of the professional elements is accountability. So it's really not whose job is it so much, it's how do we hold ourselves accountable? You know what I think happens oftentimes with lofty goals like environmental stewardship? We say, yeah, we're gonna go green, or we're gonna include environmental stewardship in everything we do. But that's where it ends. And so unless it gets into a strategic plan with action steps, with metrics, with reporting, with timelines, it doesn't tend to happen. And this is with any improvement process we have. So being accountable to the data, for one, and to reminding people and reporting back to people what's happening is another. There are real opportunities to weave this into other improvement processes in an organization, either university or hospital. The next of my key framework items is science. Now, this should go without saying, but it doesn't these days. So we need to always anchor ourselves to science because, again and again through those foundational documents, it says nursing is an evidence-based practice. That doesn't mean the evidence is always there. We know that too. We know that from clinical decisions to environmental decisions. But we can use the precautionary principle, which says that when it's not fully clear, we still want to err on the side of caution. If we think there's a risk and we have a viable alternative, we want to use the viable alternative, even if the science is not completely clear. Also, to advance this science, we want to contribute to the body of knowledge because it's not easy to find some of these resources. We want to pull them together through a nursing voice and get them published and out there. The last of my key professional elements is engagement. So this is the same as on my UDI wheel, but a little bit bigger, because this is really how we tie all this together, how we make sense of it to ourselves and to others, to the public, to other disciplines, starting with communication. So you've probably heard that you have to communicate 7 times, 7 ways. Have you heard that? And it's because people don't read their email. So what, a quarter of people read their email. I don't know, half of people look at social media. Once a poster's been on the wall for 3 days, it turns into wallpaper. So things like that. So you have to try again and again to reach people. I like the idea of therapeutic rumor or buzz, and that's just to kind of put a little seed out there to get people interested, and then they seek it out. So it's a form of active learning to say, hey, I want to know more about that particular chemical you mentioned. I think it's a real opportunity to help people work on what they care about. Also, this idea of connecting this to the meaning in their own life. A lot of people, a lot of nurses talk to me about how concerned they are about their children about this, and their grandchildren now that I'm older. And this is a great opportunity for them to be able to do something positive that helps relieve that burden, because that's a burden to them personally when they feel that. Similarly, purpose. Many times, and I was talking with this to others about this as well, we have found that nurses who are kind of burnt out, kind of getting through the day, kind of wanting to retire before long, don't want to be involved in any sort of leadership or shared governance or active engagement. And this may happen at universities too, I'm not sure. But this sometimes really fuels them because it's been a frustration for a long time. And man, to tap their wisdom of having been nurses for 20 or 30 years, this is a fantastic opportunity. So one more thing on this slide is the important opportunity for us here also is to link this to health. So oftentimes in the sustainability world, in the stewardship world, and I may have already said this, I think I said it this morning, oftentimes on the councils I'm on, at our system level, I'm the only nurse and the only clinician. And sometimes the line stops in sustainability work where the clinical world begins because people don't know how to access it. They say, well, we can't do anything about that, that's a clinical decision. And what I say is, well, of course, everything that we do is a clinical decision at some level. And so we need interpreters. This is a real opportunity for nursing because we understand the clinical world. We talk to people at all levels. We translate complex information in understandable terms on a daily basis. And we need to be able to do that, especially with health outcomes. We also know that when we talk about the climate messaging, that what has been the most useful in studies is when we start to talk about health. Because when we talk about the global idea of, wow, we're killing our planet, that doesn't relate on a daily basis. I mean, it does to me, and it does to many of you, I'm sure. But when you're up against, I gotta pay the bills, I gotta get my kids to school, my son keeps getting asthma attacks, that's far away. When we say, your son's asthma attacks are probably related to that, then that helps people start to connect the dots. That's really important. Also, I would say, working with leaders in healthcare, there are two big messages that I have found helpful. One is dollars, and usually this work saves money. You may not think so, but it actually usually does. And two is health. When we can link it back to, this is making actually our health outcomes worse, or this is putting risk into the equation that we don't need, then that makes sense. Okay, so I have this short list of these elements that I just went over: professional obligation, leadership, education, accountability, science, and engagement. And you can see it spells another nice little word. So it's please. And this is a structure that I hope is easy to remember that helps us guide this. To bring it all together, we have our content domains, our bullseye, our levels of action, our please elements, and it's in the context of planetary disruption. So this is just a pictorial idea of this, but it's really the concepts that I'm after. But this tells us that we have our professional key elements around the outside. And these are important for any aspect, anything we address. We have our circle with bullseye in the middle, and those arrows are our intentions and our progress that will drive us toward what we're obligated to do, which is environmentally safe and healthy practice. And it brings in this vague, free-floating, planetary level harm that is a reality and that we need to anchor. Okay? So, as mentioned, the please elements can be related to any nursing issue. You could apply them to infection control, you could apply them to pediatric care, because that is the fundaments of our profession. I went through all of them, all 3 books, and I pulled out what I think is basically all of them if you bucket them how I'm thinking. And I think we can't do without any of them, and I think it's fairly complete as described. You may think otherwise, and that's fine. I'm all about conversation. Also, I just point out this can be used in any site level. Nurses practice all over the place in all sorts of sites. I consider every aspect of nursing in some degree practice, even faculty roles, because we're practicing education. Clinical practice is different, but still. In all of our roles, and it's important to reach our advanced practice nurses in their specifics, because there are specific elements to call out in the different roles and in any type of focus. And it points us toward future development and research. So, for instance, to compare the effectiveness of processes and products. So, which really is better? Is it better to use reusable isolation gowns or disposable isolation gowns? I think I have the answer to that one. That one's pretty easy. But there are others that are not so easy. We need to do cost-benefit analysis. We need to do a materials assessment. We need to look at the life cycle costs and impacts of these different products that we purchase, because remember that we're purchasing them en masse. Our health system, which is large, 52 hospitals in 7 states with 40,000 nurses, we spend $1.5 billion a year on purchasing. So the decisions we make for one product has a tremendous impact. I'm not saying that each of you in a clinical role will do that, but somewhere along the way, nurses are making those decisions about nursing products. Best approaches for education and engagement. What's the best way to do this? How can we teach? How can we include? How can we inspire? Specific measures for performance levels. What I really want to know is what really is safe and healthy practice? How do we know we're there? And how would we determine that? This is an important question, since that is a guide for us and has been since 2010. Identify and measure this span of control. I mentioned that I circled those things in the We Act frame that we can affect more easily than others, but can't we really affect more because we work interdisciplinary and we work across levels all the time? And developing a methodology for the gap analysis. So I'm saying that with We Act, any of you now can walk into a place and do a quick mini assessment. Go into a new building or a store or your home and say, okay, what's going on here for waste? Are they reducing? Are they picking waste? Are they segregating waste? Is the signage clear? Are the methods working? How about energy? What do we know about the fossil fuel mix? What's the EUI, the energy use index in a hospital or a building? What about ag and food? What are the options and what are they doing with dishware and chemicals in the food? How about other chemicals for cleaning and for other use and transportation? So how could we refine that so that it's an easy-to-use tool so that we have more clarity about that? Just like if you walk into a patient room, now you can see how ready you are for the care of that patient. When you look at isolation materials, for instance, or other. Again, I'm always trying to lobby for more published studies because there are not many out there. And this really, I believe, needs to be a specialty area in nursing practice because it's complex, it's bleeds into almost every other study, under the sun because it touches so much, and yet it's at the heart of our practice. So I think we need experts in environmental impacts of our practice, just like we need experts in the infection impacts of our practice. In fact, I've said, when I started nursing, we didn't pay so much attention to infection. We kind of assumed people were going to get infected if they were on chemotherapy or if they were immunocompromised or if they were kind of weak and elderly. We kind of just figured, well, they're going to get infected. And so we didn't always, nobody really watched our hand washing. We didn't have secret shoppers. We didn't have cameras. We didn't have any of that we do now. That has completely changed, and we take it incredibly seriously. We debrief after every infection. We get like 2 urinary tract infections a year at my hospital, and it's a big deal. And so at the same time, right now, we're paying no attention to this other aspect of harm. I think that will change over time, but as I've said, not in my career because I'm getting closer to the end of my career, but in some of your careers, and perhaps some of you will take an interest in that. Lastly, on this slide, this is a great opportunity to link to the quadruple aim. So you know about the quadruple aim out of IHI. What I've seen in terms of hospitals who really do this well, they tend to also do really well on other markers, Magnet, Baldrige Award, Leapfrog, other accreditations, Joint Commission, et cetera, because it's really it's a process expertise. It's really about driving waste out of the system and working well with multiple complex situations. Patient experience, I can say anecdotally at least that this really takes you down the road in terms of what patients appreciate. We hear it all the time. We have had a strong program for a long time, and we're certainly known for that in our part of the world. We also had these wonderful sets of events we called Turning the Tide, Reclaiming Human Health by Restoring the Planet. And one year, Dr. Pats came, and he has a connection to Montana, but it was great to have him there, and it was the year we focused on climate change. Now, this was back in 2013, so it's been a while. But I still have people asking me, are you going to do another Turning the Tide? And so that's an important interaction that we can have in the community. So that's a benefit. Cost, as I mentioned, and I didn't go into very much detail today about that, but I could, because most of these processes are are conserving resources, therefore they save money. At our hospital alone, and this is a 250-bed hospital in Montana, I track that because we track everything, and we save more than now $1 million every year just based on this work. So that's accumulative over time, but that really contributes to our bottom line because margins are not thick in healthcare. They're thin. And so what we can take out in terms of cost is an important thing to do. Right now I'm working with 13 hospitals in our region, and we have done a really great analysis of everybody's impacts on some key features that we've gotten from Practice Green Health and others. And what we've learned that if all 13 hospitals just got to the mean, so we said if everybody just got to the average level, so if they're underperforming, if they brought their performance to an average on these counts, $4 million savings in 1 year. So this is why we need to keep that conversation going as well. And I spend a lot of time on cost analysis. And then lastly, worker joy. So we've talked about that before. That's one of the quadruple aims, and it's a way that we can hopefully help people address this concern that they have, and also move the profession forward and our impacts down. All right, so that sums the framework. So thank you for wading through that with me. I wasn't sure if I could fit it all in. It's kind of a lot. And I want to share a couple more opportunities and resources for you. Then we'll have questions. So I hope you know about Annie. Do all the nurses in the room know about this organization? It is the Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments. It's the only national nursing organization working in this space. And the website is environ.org. It's about 10 years old, 11 years old now. We have work groups, we have the climate committee, and we have the co-chair of the climate committee right here, Jessica LeClaire. We have a fellowship that's brand new. Oh, there she is. And you all have a new fellow who will start this fellowship for the first time. This is the inaugural year in June, and that's Paula, is it Bizot or Bizot? Bizot. So congratulations to both of you, and thank you for your contributions. This is an exciting organization that's really picking up speed. So check it out. Nurses Climate Challenge. Some of you have been exposed to this through Jessica's work and perhaps others. So again, this is an initiative that was started by a nursing professor in the University of Minnesota, and Healthcare Without Harm and Annie contributed, including myself, but I'm not the lead author. And it is an opportunity with ready-to-go resources so that nurses can teach other health professionals about climate and health, particularly. Not necessarily the science about climate change. We do not have to be climatologists to explain the health impacts. And we set the goal of educating 5,000 health professionals by the end of 2019, which we accomplished by February. So we have changed that goal to 50,000 in 5 years. Free and available to everyone. The chant that Dr. Scott mentioned is the Climate, Health, and Nursing Tool. So the purpose of this tool is to be a longitudinal measure of where nurses are in terms of awareness, what they're seeing in their patients, what they're doing about it, and what motivates them or demotivates them. It's designed a little bit like the Yale study over time and the George Mason University study that gives us the 6 Americas, if you know about that. But the point of it is really to track the profession, because what we're trying to do, and my goal in a talk like this and elsewhere, is to really just nudge the profession along in this regard so that we can be more on track with a healthy future. So I would ask all of you today or tomorrow to go take this. It's available to all nurses and nursing students. And you can Google it just by putting in Environ Survey or Environ Chant or Climate and Health Survey, or you can actually write that little link down, or this might be available in slides. And so, and furthermore, we ask every nurse takes this once a year, because we're looking at this over time. We're looking at change in our perception over time. Thank you. NEAT is the Nurses Environmental Awareness Tool, also Dr. Scott mentioned, and this is available and used frequently, and this is great for small projects in your unit or capstone projects for DNPs. It's a validated tool for before and after measurement or measurement spot checking on nurses' awareness of these impacts, how related they think they are to health, what they do about it at work, and how difficult or easy that is, what they do about it at home, and how difficult or easy that is. So it's been super interesting, and I've got the survey open right now with 7 hospitals in Providence, and I've got about 1,500 responses, so I'm waiting for one more hospital to finish, then I look forward to diving into that data. Because when I looked at this before, which was 7 years ago, the only clinical space that had any statistical difference in terms of behaviors, do you have a guess of which clinical space was not doing as much as the others? Across 7 hospitals, and it was a significant. Any guesses? I was very disappointed because it's where I came from. ICU. I was surprised. At my hospital, the ICU nurses are some of the most active. Anyway, that may mean that we need to talk about that more. We need to look at workload. We need to make some of those connections between that sense of urgency and also our broader public health commitments. The Nurses Summit on Environmental Health is another resource, but this is happening next week, so you may not make it this year, but please plan on this in a future year. We have started through Annie, and again, I'm on the board, but I don't get any money, so it's not a conflict. And we offer this in conjunction with CleanMed. And this year, Gina McCarthy is going to be one of our guest speakers. We're thrilled to have her. Bev Malone, who is the ED of, and Anna Castro-Thompson, who's the former ED of the National Hispanic Nurses Association. It ought to be a really great 2 days, so keep that in mind as a resource as well. And the aforementioned Nurses for Healthy Environments podcast. So this is something I've done, again, for our organization for the last couple years. I think there are about 40 posted, and I try and get one out every couple weeks or so. So it's really been fascinating to speak with nurses around the country and actually in other countries, Finland, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, UK. I have one coming up with Sweden, to understand how do nurses see this and what do they do about it? And it's not just about environmental stewardship, it's about anything that they're doing related to environment and health. So I have once again affirmed my utter commitment and faith in nursing by talking with these expert nurses from around the nation and world. And it gives me great, great heart. A few more. Practice green health and healthcare without harm, I mentioned. This additional list gives you other opportunities. CAMEL is a climate change source for educational materials. And there are lots of resources out there, and Annie also can provide others. And so our call to action. I take this seriously, as you can tell. I feel like we are at a point in time when really everyone alive right now, this is on our plate. We don't have that much choice about it from the way I see it. I read that 50% of greenhouse gases that are currently loaded in the atmosphere have happened during my career, during the last 30 years. I think, whoa, man, I have played a role in that, haven't I? I'm not saying I'm to blame for climate change, or certainly none of you on your own are to blame for climate change, but our collective actions have created this. It's not just us, it's the whole world. And it's really, really difficult to change from within the structures that exist. But I still don't see a way around it if we really want to have and hold a healthy future for other generations and other species. So the time is nigh for us as the nursing profession to respond. I like to use this other framework, the REAP model, and that came out of the IOM report on nursing health and environment from 1995. Because we need to continue to conduct our research. We need to get more messaging out about practice and about what's relevant to us as a profession. We need to emphasize this in our education, as mentioned, both formally and informally, to continue to keep ourselves abreast of what's coming out in the science. We need to advocate not only for our individual patients, but for the health of the whole, and that includes the health of the planet in that planetary health sense, because those are real and measurable outcomes that we now have before us, and to reduce this aspect of harm from our practice. I love this quote, which you've probably seen before, which is originally from the Talmud, though it's been written. Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Walk humbly now, do justly now, mercy now. Not expected to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon. As we act, please